My name is Laurie Beagle. I'm Managing Director at Forums International, and my co-host is Mr. Nigel Dickinson. Nigel?
Hello there, and welcome everyone. I know Laurie's about to welcome everyone, so I won't steal his thunder, but pleased that we've got such a good turnout, and I hope you enjoy and get some value out of this morning's session.
We have just a few things I'm going to go through just to start off with. Being a Zoom meeting, we would ask you to stay on mute, but please use the chat button or come off mute if you want to make a point. We want to try and make it as interactive as we can. We've got some fantastic presentations today, and I'm sure I'll speak on behalf of all of the presenters. I'm sure they would be happy to take questions. So we'd like to get you as involved as we possibly can. So I think you've got the agendas anyway, but I'll just quickly run through it. So we're going to kick off in a second with Amber Burridge from Head of Fraud Intelligence at CIFAS. And CIFAS, of course, are one of our partners for this. They're just joining, let's let them in. Followed by Alan Norton, Head of Intelligence at Graydon. And Alan, of course, does a session at every meeting. And so we're looking forward to seeing the next update for that, and the next chapter. So, and then there'll be a short break. And then I'm going to just bring you up to date on our information and intelligence sharing project with Darren. Then we're really pleased to have Lee Robbins from Companies House, who's going to bring you up to date on the reform, and I'm sure you know about the survey that went out last year, and then we're going to finish off with an interactive workshop, which is going to focus more around the effects of COVID-19 on fraud and what you've seen. Darren is going to share some facts with you and some experiences and some case studies, and then we're going to get you involved, and hopefully we'll get some feedback. You'll see on the right hand side there the dates for next year. We've already put those in stone. First one in February is virtual, but we've left the others TBC at the moment, because who knows, we may well get back to we're doing face-to-face at some time next year. I think it's probably more likely September, but we'll always give you the option to join us virtually, even if you can't do it face-to-face ongoing. So just a couple of updates. Those who don't know Forums International, we run, in fact, we've just added 2 more. We run 10 forums on a quarterly basis in UK and Europe. We used to spend 60-70% of our time traveling. We now spend 60-70% of our time, or 100% of our time, doing everything by Zoom. So, and we'll continue to deliver virtually until such time as it's safe to do something different. I'm sure that you've got a LinkedIn account or a Twitter account or a Facebook account. So if you actually would like to say something about today, when appropriate, only nice things, please, we'd be only too happy for you to post something about the forum. Feedback forms, I've said that there's a link in the chat box. There's not actually a link in the chat box. I want to change that. We will be sending you an email with a link after the forum, asking you just to fill in a very short survey to tell us what you thought about the forum, because we're always looking, of course, to improve it, and also get ideas on what you'd like to see on future agendas. As I say, for questions, please use the chat button. If you're not a member of the FPN, we'd love you to become a member. There's quite a package. It's not just the 4 quarterly meetings a year. There's quite a package, and we'd be happy to expand on that. And if you're if you'd like to join before Christmas, then we have some discounts available. So just send us an email and we'll come back to you and give you the update. A nice little present for Christmas, perhaps. So, where are we next? So, I'll try to keep my piece nice and short. Amber, are you happy that you just say next slide?
Yeah, that's perfect. It saves me a job, doesn't it?
Well, it's good enough for the Prime Minister when he does his COVID-19 briefings in the afternoon. You always say next slide. So yeah, we'll do the same one. So anyway, I'm very, very pleased to have Amber along from CIFAS and the role and growth of intelligence in the fraud space. So Amber's saying, hang on, that's not my slide, but that is. So over to you, Hannah, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. So I think before I kind of really delve into today's presentation, I kind of just wanted to set the scene a little bit in terms of what I'm going to go through today. But also, just for those of you who don't know us, I'll kind of do a bit of a recap of what we do, but then also show you kind of what some of the frauds that we've seen this year. But then I think what's really important to bear in mind throughout this presentation is actually how important sharing intelligence really is in this really difficult time. So if we move on to the next slide, a little bit about me and my team. We've literally been in function for about a year now, actually. So we're still a relatively new team, but we do have a wealth of experience from law enforcement, but also from private and public sector as well. So as I mentioned, today I will go through, I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs, but I will give you a kind of brief overview of CIFAS. We're then going to have a look at that CIFAS fraud landscape in terms of what our members have been reporting to us, not only on our national fraud database, but also our internal fraud database. And then I'm going to go through kind of the role and importance of intelligence. And I think it's really key, actually, sort of being in the know, particularly at the moment. I think for me, you can have all the tools in the world and you can have all the data to match on, but actually, having that kind of awareness of what's coming towards you so that you can protect yourself and your business is absolutely vital. And that's something that I hopefully can share with you today. So if we move on then, I think this is a bit of a holding slide that says, what is CIFAS, to be fair, so we can probably just skip it. Here we go. So essentially, CIFAS, for those of you that don't know, is a not-for-profit organisation. I can say to you, hot off the press, that actually we have over 570 members now, and we actually span across 13 different sectors. So we're not just about the financial sector, we have retail in there, we have insurance, and we also have telcos, and local authorities are in there as well. But we're not just a data sharing community anymore. We are an intelligence sharing community, and through our portal, which is a year old today actually, which is another kind of really good stat for us, is that actually it's a great opportunity for kind of members to get together to say, I'm starting to see this, is anyone else seeing it? And I think it's just getting that little bit of confirmation and collaboration from your kind of peers and colleagues actually is great at the moment in terms of, you know, do I need to investigate that? Or is that actually part of the norm? Are we all being attacked by the same threat actor? Or actually is it just us? What vulnerabilities do we have? So if we move on to the next slide then, so essentially in terms of our model, if you like, from a data sharing perspective, we have the National Fraud Database. And on here, our members will submit to us cases of high-risk fraud, so essentially cases that they've investigated and they have met a standard of proof. What then happens is it's then shared on the database with other members of CIFAS, so that essentially that member can then potentially match on there. Now, what is really important about this is that there may be some key details within those cases actually that will be a real prime flag for you to kind of really look into. So for instance, it might not just be that you're matching on a same person, so the same first name, surname and date of birth, but actually there might be a bank account that's absolutely pivotal as part of a fraud network. It might be a telephone number. It might actually be an email address. So some of these details are absolutely vital for you investigating fraud. Essentially, the member will then match against that case, potentially. They can then investigate further and then once again file back to the database so that actually we kind of can see there that they've been able to confirm fraud off the back of that. So if we move on to the next slide then, this one is just a demonstration actually of how important not only sharing data is, but also intelligence. So here I appreciate you can see a bit of a chart which looks a bit, well, there's a lot going on here. Essentially, this is an identity fraud network. And what we have here is 27 different cases, essentially. And it's really difficult when you're trying to identify if you're part of a network, actually what those connecting factors are. So if my lovely assistant would like to click for me, the key thing here within this, this kind of chart that we have is that you can see the telephone number is absolutely key in like bringing all of this together. And what we have definitely seen through kind of sharing intelligence is that actually we're starting to see kind of similar telephone numbers targeting multiple members. And that's what I just want to say about this. This isn't just targeting one sector. This is cross-sector, and, you know, another sector might actually have important information to help you investigate your fraud. So if my assistant can click again, the other thing that's absolutely sort of key in this network here is that we have the same email address that pops up multiple times, once again showing those connecting factors. And we do see from an intelligence perspective, particularly when we've got key threat actors who are kind of just changing the email address ever so slightly. So one of the things that we kind of identified actually is if you've got a Gmail account, you can actually put additional kind of dots in the first bit of your email address. So for instance, with me, it could be amber.burridge@gmail.com. However, I for then put am.burr.burridge@gmail.com, I'll still get the email, but it kind of tries to bypass some of those detection rules that people have in place to try and identify that email address. Or they might kind of have a different number at the end of their name. So we're really in the habit now of sharing some of those email formats for people to look at and some of those commonalities. And then if my assistant could click again, the other key factor we have here is in relation to a same bank account being shared here. You know, not all criminals are as sophisticated as we think, and some of them will use the same account to target multiple members. And actually being able to share the circumstances in which you've identified that bank account being used to facilitate fraud is really important for the membership as a whole. So if we move on then in terms of kind of what we've been seeing essentially over these kind of first 9 to 10 months, hopefully my assistant will be able to move the slides on. Essentially, what we've really seen is the impact of COVID, I think, from a kind of a business perspective. And I think that's something I really want to highlight when I go through these stats now, actually, is to, you know, we can't just rely on statistics alone. And actually there's a wealth of information out there which will help us prevent fraud going forward. So if we have a look then, if we can move to the next slide around kind of the first 9 months of 2020, what you can see there, it does look like we kind of got a bit of a downward trajectory. And I just want to say that's not the case at all. What we have seen is that a number of our members have kind of really tightened lending criteria, but also they're not offering new products because of the impact of the pandemic that we've seen so far this year. What is absolutely important to remember as well is if we compare this to, say, the financial crisis that we had in 2008, we didn't actually see that rise in fraud until about 6 months later. But the difference with that is it was a one-off event. It was like Lehman Brothers collapsing, which kind of had this massive knock-on effect worldwide. The pandemic, as I'm sure we've all appreciated, has kind of really affected us in a number of ways this year. So we had our first national lockdown. We came out of that, went into regional lockdowns with tier restrictions. Then we went into another national lockdown. And if you're like me, you're now in another kind of restricted tier. So I'm in tier 3, which obviously means that some businesses won't be able to open and won't be able to offer the products and services that they would have previously. What we can see here is what's quite interesting is when you look at that misuse of facility, that orange line, a large number of these misuse cases are in relation to money muling, so where individuals are allowing other people to use their bank account essentially to transfer illicit funds. Now, it kind of dropped off in March, but then when the first national lockdown was eased, we saw it spike up again. And then we went into a bit of a national lockdown again, we saw a bit of a dip. And what I can say is that kind of in October, for a lot of our fraud types, actually, we did start to see a bit of a steady increase. Once again, went into a national lockdown, which has kind of really impacted the type of fraud that our members have been seeing. And that's why it's really important to think of intelligence, because, I mean, how many of us during this pandemic have received a phishing email or a text purporting to be from DVLA, from HMRC, from your local council offering you a council tax rebate? You know, we've all been sort of subjects to receiving some of this material. There are some people that have clicked on those links. However, there is going to be a period of time before, for instance, they realise their details are being used to facilitate fraud. I mean, for instance, there's been a number of quizzes on like social media because, well, a large proportion of people are using social media now because of the fact that it's a key way to stay in touch with people. So actually, when you're filling out that quiz to find out maybe what kind of animal you are or what kind of piece of fruit you are, always bear in mind actually who's behind that quiz. What are they collecting? Why are they collecting it? Why do they really need to know your first pet's name? Why do they need to know what your first car was? These are all kind of bits of information that can then be pieced together essentially to then use in the likes of fraudulent applications. And it's being mindful of our digital footprint, which is absolutely essential going forward. So if we move on to the next slide then, in terms of, well, what does this mean essentially? So what I can tell you is that without a doubt, identity fraud still accounts for the majority of cases that we see on the National Fraud Database. So as you can see there, 59% of them have been kind of recorded in relation to identity frauds. But what's worrying is the disproportionate number of them that are actually successful. And this stems back to what I was just saying about our digital footprint and being able to piece together information. Synthetic identities are kind of something that are really emerging at the moment. And to be honest, you can see why. The amount of things we've put on social media, including LinkedIn, so just a bit of a warning for you in terms of what you have on LinkedIn, there is a wealth of information on there. You've got your employment history, your education history, your photo as well for a lot of people. And we did a piece of research in 2018 that showed that actually a large number of our victims of impersonation who had a kind of a LinkedIn footprint also had a Facebook footprint. So then if you go onto Facebook and actually your profile's quite open, you can see things like maiden names, children's names, where you used to live. All this information can be pieced together to put a profile together. And one of the worrying things as well is kind of around being able to access the likes of Zoopla and Rightmove, where it might say where your house was last bought. So if you have an address associated on any kind of public-facing website, it's quite easy then to go and see when it was last bought and see if you can tie it up. So obviously, if you then get asked the question, how long have you lived at your property? Oh, that's quite easy because I know when the property was last bought, and actually it falls in line with everything else that's on all your other profiles. So synthetic identities are a real issue for not just the financial sector, but for all industry at the moment, particularly as if you can piece it together with what's already out there, with the likes of false documentation, which is so readily available now. And I'm not just talking about on the dark web, I'm talking about on normal internet. You know, there are these novelty websites that sell documentation. And actually, if you piece that together with some of the information you have from these profiles, you've basically formed a new profile. Great for trying to apply for products. One of the interesting things that we've definitely seen this year is that it is reflective of kind of the industries and how they've been operating during the pandemic. So for instance, with identity fraud, you know, we predominantly see it's plastic cards that have been targeted, but online retail and the telco sector have actually seen a large increase in frauds this year. And 19% increase in telecom products being targeted for impersonation. It's a product that's well in demand at the moment as we've kind of moved into more working remotely. But also, I think what's quite interesting as well is that it's not just a case of kind of what's currently out on your profile of where you live. And there are a large proportion still, like 11% there, of individuals who maybe haven't contacted all their service providers to tell them that they've moved home. So obviously they're then using the post from the previous occupier or the previous owner to then apply for products. In terms of misuse of facility, it kind of accounts for nearly a quarter of the cases that we've seen on the National Fraud Database. And essentially what we mean here is where someone is abusing or misusing their account or their product or service. Now, a large proportion of these, as I've kind of mentioned, are in relation to bank accounts, but also money muling. It's a real key issue. But I just want to pause for a moment and say, actually, it's not just a financial sector issue. We've definitely had reports, particularly over the COVID period, of individuals trying to recruit those who kind of can apply for universal credit, for instance. So actually apply for universal credit, you get to keep some of that money, then can you disperse it? Same with the loan sector as well. We've seen an increase in individuals kind of going in, taking loans out, but then dispersing it to other accounts. So it's not just a banking sector issue. And in terms of our profile, essentially, and I suppose I'm going to take a bit of a moment on this as well, the majority of them do fall within that 21 to 30 years old bracket. However, what is kind of really important to remember is that we do have a mule problem with our younger generations that are out there, but also the older ones as well. And I think it's going to be really interesting going forward how the impact of COVID and the economy is going to really entice some of those individuals to kind of start doing some of these transactions through their bank accounts if they get to keep a cut of it. And I think we did some research last year which actually said that sort of 22% of respondents thought that money muling was an acceptable behaviour. Now, when you think of like the age groups that kind of thought it was actually acceptable, it was actually those aged between 35 and 44 that thought it was the most reasonable type of behaviour. And that's probably because of how it was posed. You know, the question was essentially, if someone offered you £500 and asked you to transfer 400 of it, but you got to keep 100 for your effort, is that reasonable? And I suppose the phrasing of it makes it seem, actually, it's not bad. What they fail to mention is that that money is then going on to fund organised crime. It's going on to fund human trafficking, drug trafficking, modern slavery. It's a real serious issue. And I think we really need to work together as collaboratively as possible to get that message across. And then finally, facility takeover. So it saw a 20% increase during this period, and essentially where individuals' accounts are being taken over by somebody else or something else. And it's really been quite predominant in that telco and that online retail sector. What we have seen is actually since the kind of Ofcom regulations came in last year, where you can remotely access your port authentication code so that you can keep your number if you change provider. Since they did that, we've actually seen a bit of a spike in kind of unauthorized PAC code requests coming in. And I think that's the problem that we have sometimes, is that our hands are tied by regulation and legislation. But actually, it's how can we protect ourselves in terms of making sure actually that, you know, the criminals don't take advantage of that. I think one of the other things that's been absolutely key this year is looking at unauthorized facility delivery instruction. And what I mean by this is so essentially kind of saying, oh, actually, I want a new phone, but can you deliver it to this address? Quite often in these circumstances, we've had intelligence that's come in to say individuals are being socially engineered to reveal their PAC codes, so that they're kind of contacted by a third party saying, oh, you're due an upgrade. All you need to do is provide me with some information and I can get it to you. For security purposes, you're about to receive a code. If you could just give me that code, then I can make sure I can process your order. Now, having that context is absolutely vital if you want to try and influence your fraud prevention strategy. You know, stats alone won't give you that, which is why intelligence is so vital in terms of preventing fraud. So if we move on then in terms of kind of some of the insider fraud threats that we've got as well, I think if my assistant wouldn't mind moving the slide on, that'd be great. Essentially, what we've actually seen this year is, despite the fact that we haven't really been recruiting, actually we have seen quite a bit going on in the internal fraud, the insider sort of threat space. So just to draw your attention really to the fact that the majority of insider fraud cases that we get are in relation to dishonest actions, and predominantly these are in relation to theft of cash from the customer, but also from the employer. Now, what is quite interesting here is that account fraud has actually gone up 60% in the first 9 months of this year. And one of the concerns really is that as we're working remotely now, it's actually quite difficult to properly monitor a kind of a traditional 9 to 5, because actually we're having to be more flexible, particularly in the first lockdown where, you know, a lot of people had to deal with juggling family life as well as work life. We had to be more flexible in how we worked. But what we've seen in this account fraud space is kind of facilitating transaction fraud. And I guess one of the concerns that comes out of this is where we're working remotely, actually, in terms of your staff, are they being approached by threat actors, by third parties to, you know, earn a little bit of cash on the side? I think there are a lot of pressures at the moment in terms of redundancies that are going on as well. And actually, is that a bit of a driver potentially for you kind of, in terms of when you make a logical decision, actually, when you've got all these kind of external pressures on you, it can almost twist that logic slightly. And one of the things that sort of our members have said to us during this period is obviously they are concerned, because if you're going to an office, you kind of have a safe space in terms of being protected from people approaching you. When you're working from home, it's very easy to be contacted by someone via social media, by the phone, even in some areas where, for instance, there's organised crime groups that operate. They know who you are, they know where you work. So actually it's very easy for some of these staff members to be targeted. One of the other things I want to touch on is this shocking 150% increase in unlawful obtaining and disclosure of personal data. Now, although the volumes are small, just think of the scale of harm that one person could have in terms of revealing personal information. If we think about the Morrison's case, you know, very famous case that came out about the disgruntled employee that revealed 100,000 employees' payroll data on the internet, that was one person that did that. And it had a huge knock-on effect. And one of the things that's really concerning at the moment is actually a large proportion of us are actually using our own personal devices at the moment in order to access work. In terms of kind of a survey done this year, there was a disproportionate high number of individuals who could actually access files that they shouldn't be able to access. And you just think, actually, do we know what access our staff have to certain files, to certain data, what they're doing with that data? And for a business, it's absolutely crucial that you have some kind of anti-fraud culture in place so that actually it deters individuals from kind of doing that type of activity. One of the things that we've definitely kind of seen sort of during this year is that actually in terms of kind of protecting your staff, some of the awareness around cybersecurity, for instance, has been a bit difficult to implement because we had to move into lockdown very quickly. You know, there are a large number of surveys out there that have been done this year that have shown that actually employees can't tell the difference between a business email compromise sort of email coming through, a phishing email, particularly when we're working remotely. So for instance, if I got an email from my CEO saying to make a particular transaction, actually, do we have the policies and procedures in place if we're working remotely in terms of whether or not we authorize that transaction? And that's something really that's absolutely critical if we're going to do this going forward in terms of remote working, that we have some of those policies and procedures in place. So if we move on then, if anyone does have any questions, please do pop them in the chat, by the way. I feel like I'm just talking at you at the moment. I'd rather we had like a bit more interactive kind of session. So if you do have questions, do pop them in. So in terms of our activity this year, so this is kind of moving more onto the role of intelligence, essentially. Now, the CIFAS intelligence team produced its first strategic intelligence assessment this year. And what this means is that actually we could do a deep dive on some of the fraud threats that we're seeing, like what I've spoken about, but actually identify, you know, what can we do about these issues, but what do we not know about these issues as well? So for instance, if we've got a particular geographic area that's being targeted, does that overlay with what we're seeing from an organised crime perspective? Or actually, is it just because it's been displaced from another area? It's really giving us a bit of a guide in terms of what things we should actually be looking for. So if my assistant can click again, So essentially, I kind of mentioned the member portal right at the beginning. And I just want to say, actually, what we do as a team is that every day we produce a bulletin with some of those key threats that have come in overnight. So be it a cybersecurity threat, be it a financial crime threat, be it a fraud threat, we try and capture that and share with the membership. And as you can see, we've actually produced over 200 daily intelligence reports, which are available on our member portal. And then if my assistant may mind clicking again. So this is the key bit here around sharing intelligence. So over 300 fraud threats have been shared this year. And we've also got what we call 10 be aware alerts. Now, just to kind of explain what that means, the fraud threats essentially are giving you a little bit of information around something that's happening. So for instance, we've had a telephone number that's being used to facilitate identity fraud in a particular geographic area. And we want to raise that awareness with members so that actually if they do get applications matching those kind of criteria, then actually that's just a flag to maybe investigate it a bit further. The be aware alerts are more enhanced than those little snippets. If you think of it like a ticker, the fraud threats are like a ticker in terms of this is what's coming in, this is what's happening. The be aware alerts have a little bit more analysis done on them. And the most recent one that we pushed out actually was in relation to, once again, a telephone number being used to facilitate identity frauds. But within there, we captured the IP addresses. We also captured the other email addresses being used in conjunction with that telephone number. And you could see the particular hotspots where this telephone number was targeting sort of victims, essentially. So it just gives you a real good idea of kind of the threats and actually what you might need to do on your side in terms of preventing it happening in your organisation. And we also have our organised fraud intelligence group meetings. This is open to members and non-members. So if you are interested, please do get in touch. Essentially, this is a nice mix of public and private sector coming together quarterly to discuss some of those fraud threats that they've been seeing. And it is quite good to have law enforcement there as well as kind of some of the sectors, because it gets that conversation going around actually how do we tackle these fraud problems that we're seeing. And then finally, if my assistant wouldn't mind clicking again. In terms of what we do as a team then, so yes, we deal with law enforcement on a regular basis, and apologies if some of you have maybe received contact from law enforcement because of coming through us. But essentially, just to give you a snippet of where we sit in the grand scheme of things, you know, we do deal with police liaison requests in terms of if a police officer does a credit reference search, perhaps it might come up with a CIFAS marker. They'll come to us and we'll then direct them to the member that filed that case to get more information. We are part of the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, so we do obviously see what we have on our database and share any intelligence where appropriate. And one of the things that's really come out of this year is the response to COVID-19 related fraud. So we do sit on the fusion cell, which is part of the National Economic Crime Centre's response to COVID-19 related frauds. And in that respect, we advocate for our membership in terms of the fraud threats that they've been seeing, but also the intelligence. It's a joined up response, essentially, across law enforcement, public sector and private sector in how we can come together to tackle some of these issues. So if we move on then, in terms of kind of our priority areas, if you like, in terms of what we've identified from our strategic intelligence assessment, we've kind of got four main key areas here that we believe we should be focusing on, not just in membership, but across industry. You know, without a doubt, identity fraud is one of the most prolific fraud types that we see. And we kind of touched in with some members around what they've seen during the pandemic. And actually they've said, you know, impersonation scams have just gone through the roof. You know, we've definitely seen an uptick in it. So I guess the thing from us is actually having some problem statements. You know, it's no good saying something's gone up or gone down, but actually, why has it gone up? Why has it gone down? What do we need to do to tackle it? What don't we know? You know, if we empower ourselves with the knowledge of filling in some of those gaps, then that makes us stronger as a fraud prevention community. So I already mentioned about synthetic identities and associated documents. That's definitely a key area. But one of the things really is around evidencing the harm for instance, that identity fraud actually causes. And this is getting kind of law enforcement and government to really appreciate actually the impact that identity fraud has, not just on a victim, but also on a business having to deal with it as well. Misuse of facility, I kind of mentioned it accounts for nearly a quarter of the cases that we see. Without a doubt, money mules is a key issue. And like I said, not just for the banking sector, for a number of us. So actually working collaboratively to tackle the messaging around what sort of people perceive to be first party fraud in the first place is actually a real important role that we all need to play. We also think that actually we need to enhance our data a little bit more. And when I say that, it's actually tying into the intelligence side of things, actually having some context as to why we're seeing what we're seeing. Actually having that intel is, really good for you to actually implement in terms of your fraud prevention strategy. And then collaborating with members and government on actually how can we share financial crime intelligence. I think it's been a bit of a biggie. Definitely, it's not just a pandemic related issue. It's one of those things, I think it's difficult trying to share intelligence and financial crime data, but it doesn't have to be. And we're working with partners around making that easier. Facility takeover, definitely seen a massive increase this year, but also it saw a 34% increase last year. So it's a definite priority area for a number of us. And one of the key things there that you've probably identified actually is collaborating with social media companies. One of the issues that I've had in my conversations with social media companies, particularly over the past year, is that actually they're not quite aware of how their platform is being abused. So actually making them aware of how their platform's being abused actually then means that they can then take the necessary steps to try and prevent some of that. So Twitter released its financial crimes policy last year. But I think the problem that we have is that social media companies can put these policies out, but they need to empower us to be able to report that abuse if we see it. And it needs to be easy for us to do that. I think I've seen abuse in sort of public forums, for instance, where people are selling personal information, but there's nowhere for you to report that abuse to the administrators of that forum. A lot of the time, some of these kind of dead forums have been taken over, but it's being able to kind of report it, but also, dare I say, us having a bit of social responsibility in reporting it. A number of times we might just skirt over it and think someone else has already reported it. So there needs to be a real collaborative effort for all of us to work with social media companies to really make them aware of how those platforms are being abused. And then finally, when we look at internal fraud and the insider threat, without a doubt, this year has definitely thrown some challenges, I think is probably fair to say, in terms of working from home. But one of the things that we're quite keen to get across is that you don't have to just screen your staff at application stage. Circumstances change, events happen during an employee's life cycle, which actually means that, maybe you should just do not only a well-being check, of course, but actually should you check to see if that individual is kind of getting up to things that they shouldn't be doing. So for instance, we have our enhanced IFD that now allows individuals to search the national fraud database as well as the internal fraud database. And just a piece of research that I've kind of been looking at the past few weeks is that actually we do have a number of individuals on that internal fraud database that appeared on the national fraud database throughout their employment. And I think that's absolutely essential to remember going forward, is that checks don't just happen at application stage. It's applicable for like products and when you've got customers as well. It's not just at application stage. Actually, you do have the proportionality to do these screening throughout the life cycle of a customer or through the life cycle of an employee. And in terms of some of those key enablers there, and this is where Intel really comes to the fore, because actually we talk about technology and social media. I'm not a technophobe by any shape or form. However, they do obviously enhance the way that criminals can deploy their tactics. And I think having the intelligence around actually what methods are being used at the moment is really important. So for instance, we've definitely seen on the dark web some of these phishing kits that are available. Also, I spoke about one-time passcodes earlier. There are kits out there to allow you to intercept these. And essentially it's it's literally kind of there. It's a template ready to go, and it can be distributed en masse, particularly now as the majority of us are doing everything digitally. We can't lose sight of social engineering and the impact that that has. So, for instance, I spoke about victims being socially engineered to reveal their details, but also if you've got contact centre staff as well, it's always worth bearing in mind actually that they are just as vulnerable to being socially engineered by a caller. TransUnion did a blog this year in April, which showed actually a kind of criminal attempts 5 times to socially engineer contact centre staff. And actually, what we've seen, particularly, the FCA have done quite a bit of work around vulnerability, for instance, and actually what they're claiming is that they're a vulnerable customer. They can't remember their security question answers, or they try and socially engineer the contact centre agent to basically bypass some of those security checks. False documentations and identity packages, they are readily available, but I will just highlight here that actually here at CIFAS we have our facial matching tool, which has been hugely successful in terms of being able to identify, for instance, if you've got a face that appears on different documents with different details. Now, it's been absolutely crucial for a number of our members being able to do that in terms of identifying the false documentation that they've got. And it's really interesting because I won't lie, we do have Will Smith on our National Fraud Database. His photo has been used on documentation like driving licenses and passports. And we currently have over 4,000 documents actually that have a face on it for people to match against. And then finally, I'll kind of round this up really around from an intelligence perspective, actually, what should we focus on? And without a doubt, it is understanding that cross-sector connection. I'm a firm believer that actually we shouldn't look at financial crime and fraud in silos. They are actually joined together. So if you take the money muling issue, for instance, the abuse of the account, yes, that's fraud. The transfer of accounts, that's the money laundering. But where's the money come from? Potentially it's a scam of some sort, and that's where that money has come from. So it's just making that linkage, which is going to be really, really important so that we understand how to deal with the fraud threat in the first place. The other thing I kind of wanted to touch on really is fraud typologies. Here at CIFAS, we talk about identity fraud, misuse of facility takeover, but actually segmenting that even more in terms of actually in that journey, where are the potential intervention points in terms of preventing any fraud from occurring? And we're trying to map that out now in terms of actually understanding that customer journey as well around when you take out a product or service, and actually how we can enhance the services that we offer as an organisation to help in those intervention points. So if we move on then, I'm kind of going to give you a little bit of a highlight really around some of the intel that we've kind of received during this period. So essentially, some of the intelligence predominantly, and it's probably no surprise to a number of us, has been in relation to those hospitality grants and the bounce back loans space. Now, just to say, with the hospitality grants, we had a phishing email that was going around to a number of local authorities, basically purporting to be from a big brand saying, I need the business rates of these locations so that I can apply for the hospitality grant. It looked genuine, it looked really good. However, it was just a tiny little difference in the email address. So for instance, it was like an additional S or something in one of the brand names. Very difficult to spot. And I think it's really important to identify that there was a lot of pressure put on a number of organisations to administer these grants and loans during this period. And actually what we've kind of found is that there are a number of post checks going on now, but what we could do is we sent it out to over 700 contacts, our alert, to try and raise awareness around actually these are the kind of companies that are being impersonated to take out some of these grants and loans. Similarly, if you're also a business yourself, you have been sort of susceptible during this period, particularly if you've got a third party coming to you saying, actually, we can do all this application for you. You just need to give us your details and we'll take care of it. You haven't got to worry about it. So on that respect, we're having a number of businesses being impersonated for the likes of bounce back loans, but also in terms of application fraud as well. We've definitely seen a number kind of exaggerating their income in order to get that loan. And you've probably seen in the news where people have spent it on like high-end cars, etc. You know, it's been a real issue this year for a number of our members. I think also what was interesting with the kind of bounce back loans is that actually what we saw in the mule space actually changed as well. So usually we'd see kind of recruitment adverts for particularly fintech type products, you know, it's quick and easy, fintech account that will help us move stuff quicker. They moved to that more company related products, you know, getting a business account actually to help facilitate some of these fraudulent applications. In terms of consumers, I think it's been quite interesting during this period to see right at the beginning where we had a lot of fear about COVID-19 and the pandemic. We did see a number of victims being targeted for the likes of testing, PPE equipment, we can come and deep clean your house. And we saw a number of like even toilet roll. Remember when everybody went mad and bought all the toilet roll and pasta? You know, we saw kind of fake adverts for toilet roll and pasta as well, and fake COVID vaccines even back then. Obviously with the rollout now, that is definitely something that we're keeping an eye on in terms of criminals taking advantage of that. But home workers have also been heavily targeted this period. So, for instance, they've had calls from individuals claiming to be part of their IT department. You know, there's a problem with the service. Can you just give us access to your remote desktop? We'll log on, we'll make some changes, and then you'll be good to go. What they're actually doing is they're harvesting credentials to your network. And we've definitely seen that, and the likes of, like I mentioned earlier, the business email compromise. Also the likes of Zoom, dare I say it, has been targeted in terms of phishing emails. You know, there's a meeting going on, click on this link to join. They have found any way possible to target home workers and consumers during this period. And I think if we move on to the insider fraud threat as well, it's been really interesting in terms of how we deal with that insider fraud threat as we work remotely. Like I said, there is no 9 to 5 anymore, but it's also actually how many of your employees kind of work in shared accommodation. And if they do work in, like, live in shared accommodation, it might be that the kitchen is the best place for the Wi-Fi. But are they still going to lock their computer to make a drink, to go to the toilet, when actually someone else could then access their computer? I mean, I heard a story, you know, obviously juggling family life, where an individual told me they came in and saw their 3-year-old daughter up at their laptop. And it's like, you know, it is quite funny. But actually, just think, you know, 3-year-olds are quite clever. She could have pressed a button and done something. So it's just being mindful of treating your home workspace the same as you would your office workspace. We've definitely kind of seen around the economic strains in terms of motivator for staff approaches. So, you know, we've seen on the dark web during this period, individuals offering their service to help support some of that loan applications. They're like, contact me, I can get your loan through, just let me know your details and I'll do it for you. You know, staff are selling their skills and expertise, but against the business. And it's been a very difficult time, I think, particularly if your household are suffering redundancies, you know, to not fall into that motivation of, oh, actually, it's just a bit of money, the business is big enough, it can take it. You know, it's definitely attitude we need to challenge. So I'm mindful of time, actually. So if we move on, I think literally the last bit really is around questions. I appreciate we've only got a couple of minutes. However, I am happy for after this as well, for any questions to come to me. That's our Intel inbox, or should say .org.uk, apologies. But do obviously kind of get in touch with us in terms of any threats that you're seeing, but also about getting involved in some of that intelligence sharing as well. I know you've got a session on it this morning, and it's quite exciting to see actually how you guys are progressing with that. But I think if I just have a quick look in the chat, do we have any questions? Let's have a look. Either that or I've just bored you all to death.
Amber, can I ask a quick question? It's Nigel Dickinson.
Yes, of course.
I concur with Alan's comments that the intelligence alerts that you put out are extremely valuable. I understand that the actual CIFAS data can only be shared within the cooperative of members because it's sensitive data and everyone needs to sign up to the process. But have there been any discussions within CIFAS about sharing the intelligence to the wider business community? Because there's clearly huge value to that wider community.
Yeah, so it's definitely a piece of work that we're currently working on. We've got a bit of a project going on because essentially we're not a law enforcement body and we're not an investigative body. So we're trying to work out from a legal perspective how we can share some of this stuff. And I think, you know, like you say, around kind of sharing with the wider communities, definitely we need to make kind of business community aware of the threats that are coming. At the moment we share kind of that more strategic intel, however we are exploring ways that we can share that more granular detail in terms of, you know, it's not just about getting the green light to share some of that personal information. It's all about the delivery mechanism, how you store that information, how you weed it, how you ensure that the recipients use it in the way it was intended. You know, it's a bit of a journey that we're going on, I think is fair to say. But, you know, I definitely, my background's law enforcement, and I definitely see the kind of the use of being able to share wider than our kind of our current membership. But from an intelligence perspective, we're looking to grow it anyway. And, you know, if it's through our community membership that we offer, or if it's through some of these alerts, then actually working out the right mechanisms, particularly as there are a number of other organisations that send out intel alerts, and I don't want to make it noisy and send the same stuff out. So there is a question there of a kind of more coordinated role. Does that come from the National Economic Crime Centre, for instance, around distributing some of this intelligence? So I am working on it, and hopefully maybe I could give you an update for your next meeting in terms of where we've got with that.
That's great, thank you.
We'll certainly take you up on that, Amber. Thank you very much. Yeah. So yeah, and I've always wanted to be an assistant. So
glamorous assistant.
Exactly right. Yeah. Thank you very much. So spot on time. Thank you very much. If anybody's got any questions or think of any questions at all, put them in the chat box and we'll pass them on to Amber anyway. And as you say, your contact details are there as well. So just to say thank you very much. Really interesting, and there was a lot to that. So maybe
apologies.
That's right. Well, the recording will be available. So okay, right, we're going to move on if that's okay. So thanks very much. Right, so I'd like to move. Go the right way. Right, so I'd like to now hand over to Alan Norton, Head of Intelligence from Graydon, who is going to do his update. And are you with us, Alan?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laurie, and good morning, everybody. Thanks to Amber for that very informative presentation. Laurie, if you could be Debbie McGee again. And
I've been lots of things. I've been called lots of things.
Yes, just to hopefully give you a bit of insight today on the current threats, what's happened in the past and what we expect to happen in the future. So Laurie, next slide, please.
Okay.
That's just a little bit about me. I've been working in the industry for more than 24 years now and joined Graydon, believe it or not, back in 1999.
Was it that long ago?
It's that long ago, Laurie. Next slide, please. We'll probably move on from this slide. This is just a corporate holding slide that tells you people a bit about Graydon. We are a corporate business-to-business credit reference agency. So when we receive intelligence, the key thing for us is trying to prevent fraud at source. So if we suspend recommendations on a business due to intelligence we've received, that will hopefully prevent our clients who rely on our credit ratings from setting up accounts and being defrauded in that way. Next slide, please, Laura. So today I'm just going to go through the latest figures from our perspective. It's all business to business, B2B. Some of the latest threats, what we've learned from the past, and what the future risks currently will be. So the first real slide, 2020 year to date. We sent out 346 intelligence fraud alerts to our memberships. Total value there of just under £33 million. Whilst it's a high figure, it's invariably just touching the tip of the iceberg. The average value there is just over £95,000, which may seem high to some, but this is across the whole UK business population. We've had, for instance, fraud from the telecom sector, which run into the millions. In the IT supply sector, the average value would be around £35,000 to £40,000. To, say, fuel card distribution, those supplying fuel cards, maybe the average fraud's there between £5,000 and £10,000, I would suggest. But across the whole UK business population, this is what we've seen year to date. Next slide, please, Laura. Compared to 2019, we've actually seen a reduction in the value identified, a reduction of 19% on the weekly value we've identified on our database. Now, at first glance, this may seem very counterintuitive, but it should be remembered that we've come from a very high base in 2019 where record levels of fraud were reported, and there may be a number of factors at play here with these figures, including, as Amber alluded to, a reduction in economic activity during lockdown. A reduction in activity leads to a reduction in fraud. We've also heard of a load of new frauds and scams that have come into the marketplace. So a lot of these may yet to be identified, and the knock-on effect we suspect will be identified when the recession really starts to bite in 2021. So there's a delay in detection, which I think Amber alluded to as well. Next slide, please, Laurie. The latest threats. Well, literally, as you can see there, any new financial support scheme introduced by the government has attracted fraudsters like to a honeypot. If there's one phrase I want you to remember from today, it's probably that one. We've heard a lot about fraud due to the furlough schemes, the business bounce back loans, where there's been multiple applications from the same source to get business bounce back loans. Has the validity of the lenders giving out those loans been the same as if it was their own money, because that money's been guaranteed by the government? Perhaps if there's anyone on the call here today from the banking community, will be able to give me a bit more information on that. But there's been over 150 COVID support schemes introduced by the government since the start of the pandemic. There's a minority of individuals that have attacked those schemes, claiming that support illegally. Although it's good to know that a new COVID fraud hotline has been launched by the government. However, that wasn't published until the 13th of October this year. So the words horse and bolted would really sort of spring to mind from me, because the fraudsters are always there at the very start of the process. Next slide, please, Laurie. So what have we learned from the past? Got an image there of one of the founding fathers of the United States, Benjamin Franklin. And he was a visionary, as you can see, because he was already wearing a COVID mask. Study from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners following the credit crunch, the last real major economic recession globally, concluded that the financial pressures of an economic crisis lead to an increase in fraud. That's also recently been backed up by the professor at the Centre for Counter-Fraud Studies at the University of Portsmouth, who they show that recessions show a direct correlation between a fall in economic output and an increase in fraudulent activity. Next slide, please, Laurie. So what can we learn from the past? One of the reasons for increase in incidents of fraud during recessionary times has been attributed to the removal of middle management. Those that offer in the first line of defence to detect fraud are quite often the first to be laid off during a recession. In effect, this amounts to a change in business strategy without a change in the business process. When making redundancies of this type, internal controls are reduced, making the business more vulnerable to fraudulent attacks. And it's something senior management should really consider during what we are likely to face in the coming months and years. Next slide, please, Lauren. I suspect many of you on the call today will be familiar with the concept of the fraud triangle. The fraud triangle was created by criminologist Donald Creasley in the 1950s. And really it's a framework used to explain the motivation for an individual's decision to commit fraud themselves. What you need to bear in mind here is that the elements of the fraud triangle, the incentive, the attitude, and the opportunity, due to the global economic decline, are now present like never before. So the motivation is there like never before. Next slide, please, Laurie. An extension of the fraud triangle is the fraud diamond. And this is where the concept of capability must also be taken into account. This was developed in 2004, and within the capability, 6 extra factors have been included. So the person committing the fraud needs to have the right position within an organisation and also the appropriate expertise. That can also include the use of the latest technologies. So if they're technologically proficient, they have the ability there to be able to, and the expertise to take advantage of the vulnerabilities of people's systems. They also need to have the confidence to be able to carry off new scams and the ability to coerce others into their operation. They also need to be able to deal with the stress of committing illegal activity as well. That's a human trait, as well as the final factor there under capability, being a good liar. Are they believable? And as Amber mentioned, all that social engineering, gathering all those extra data items that are out there on the internet from social profiles, can help build their story and make it more believable. What also comes into play here is a human behaviour rule. Don't know if people have heard it on the call before, is the 10-80-10 rule. It plays a part in everything we do, whether we're surviving a disaster, solving a crime, winning at sports, or thriving within business. But in the context of fraud, the 10-80-10 rule, quite simply, states 10% of the population will never commit a fraud. They're honest, they're the type of person that if they found a mobile phone left on a table in a pub, they'd hand it in. 80% of the population might commit fraud given the right combination of factors in the fraud diamond. Now, as I've said on the previous slide, all these factors are now in play like never before. Whilst 10% of the population are actively looking to try and commit ways of fraud. So, 80-10.
Can I just, Alan, can I just interrupt? I think somebody's getting some background noise. Can you just make sure everybody's on mute, please?
Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah. I don't know.
The factors are present like never before. So this is the actual background.
Yeah.
Next slide, please, Laurie.
Yeah, okay. Don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah, I can hear that as well, but never mind. I can, if people can still hear me.
So I have the magic button here to put people on mute, so I will let's find out.
Can you mute all apart from myself?
Trouble is, I don't want to mute to you as well. So, I don't know where that's coming from.
I'll plough on. No problem. Unfortunately, this is coming. The UK is set to suffer its worst economic decline in over 300 years. The Office for Budget Responsibility say unemployment's going to reach its highest level since the financial crisis. And the Centre for Economics and Business Research indicates 330,000 businesses are at risk of insolvency. Compile those with the following reckoning points, where strike-off action at Companies House has been reinstated in the middle of October. Government loan schemes, some of those ended at the end of last month. Crown preference has been reinstated this week, so unsecured creditors get pushed further down the pecking order. Brexit, a lot of people now know it's coming up fast and furious on the 31st of December. Business rate holidays end in March 2021, as do VAT referrals and some lender payment holidays. Put all those elements together, I now believe we're in the perfect storm. Next slide, please, Laurie. So, as I've said, the bad news is all the key factors are in place for fraud to reach record levels, and I'm almost certain that we will see this effect in the coming months and years. However, I've been a bit of a doctor of doom so far today, so there is some good news. Remember, effective fraud risk management more than pays for itself. Attacking fraud offers a huge cost saving and opportunity for a relatively low investment. Maybe a point to mention at people's upcoming annual reviews is the counter fraud professional community. You know, companies are desperate to reduce costs, but actually the return on investment in employing the right people with the right expertise is massive. So Laurie, if we can just move on to my final summary slide. So although record fraud levels appear to have decreased, actually that's probably a function of the reduced economic activity during the lockdown periods and the delay in identifying either new fraud scams or if you've actually been attacked and this bad debt, well actually that was a fraudulent attack. That will come out in the coming months and years, I'm sure. Financial support schemes from the government have been attracted like bees to a honeypot. There is a direct correlation between economic downturn and a rise in fraudulent activity. Removing the experienced middle management leaves you very vulnerable to attack. The fraud triangle and fraud diamond factors are present like we've never seen before. The worst economic decline for over 300 years is on the way. However, as counter fraud professionals, you can do something about the issue. You are a low-cost solution with an attractive ROI for employers. So really today that concludes sort of my update for this session, and more than happy to answer any questions the audience may have.
You said there was a downturn a little bit, Alan, from last year, was it 19% downturn?
In value of and volume of frauds we've identified within grading, yes.
Okay. When do you're forecasting that that's going to reverse and go back up again, starting beginning of next year, or?
Yeah, I think there's again a very big correlation with insolvency rates, which have dipped, but largely the insolvency rates have dipped due to lack of court action, the change in company legislation preventing creditor action. We expect those to spike at the end of Q1 2021, and more of this fraud to be uncovered and identified in the early part of next year.
Yeah. There's that prediction. There's going to be a tsunami in the beginning of the year.
Yeah, I mean, as the economic recession really starts to bite, as I said, with unemployment set to go through the roof, we've seen this week, 12,000 people from Debenhams. We've seen Arcadia Group collapse. There will be many, many more. And as more and more people get more and more desperate through redundancy, their motivational factors increase, and they are likely to take increased risk and commit crime.
Yeah. And of course, all those redundancies, well, the impact of Arcadia and Debenhams is not just on those businesses, but also other businesses which are connected to them as well. So
that's a very good point. The knock-on supply chain effect is huge.
It is, yeah. And any other questions from any? Sorry, I'm doing all the questioning. Is there any questions from anybody out there? It's gone very quiet, Alan. Anyway, I thought thank you very much for that. As usual, very, very insightful and very informative. Thank you very much indeed, Anna. And
just click on the last slide. Then, if anyone wants to contact me in the future,
there he is.
Please email me, and I'll respond to you when I can.
Okay, right. Well, we're slightly ahead of schedule, you can be pleased to know. So what we do, we'll try and keep ahead of schedule for the rest of the morning. So that means we'll finish a little bit early. So what we do now, we'll take a 15-minute break. I did mention earlier about the if you're interested to become a member of the FPN. There's a deliberate mistake there. It's not the FPM, it's the FPN. I've listed there the package, the parts of the package with the 4 meetings a year, the webinars that we do in between, and etc. So please have a read through that, and while you're having your next cup of coffee. So 15 minutes from now, so that I make that 10 past now. So we're going to we'll kick off again at 25 past, which puts us about 10 minutes ahead of schedule. Good. Hello everybody, welcome back, and I make it 25 past, so we shall move on to the next subject, which is information intelligence sharing. Now, just to paint the picture a little bit, when we started the FPN back in May 2019, certainly from the first couple of meetings, the feedback we were getting very much from the attendees and the members since was that this should be a very important part of something of the membership, and something that we should develop. And Darren and Hodder and myself have took that on as a challenge, and I just want to give you a very between us, just give you a very quick update on where we are. And so I'll just go to the next slide. I think first off, we should say thank you much for everybody who's provided input to this project. It's been quite invaluable. We have at previous meetings presented an outline which dated back a little way, so we've been able to take everybody's input and update that that output. That's the project plan as such. So we've written a new specification, or should I say, Darren's written a new specification, and which we've had discussions with some of our partners. We've talked to Lee at CIFAS. We've also talked to Graydon and some other partners as well, bringing them up to date on where we are and what our objectives were. We've also had discussions, or Darren has had discussions with potential developers, because we've decided that the best way forward for this is to actually keep it nice and simple, but to have something we'll develop ourselves, and then as the initial module, and then we'll expand on that. Did you want to add to that, Darren?
Yeah, just to say that now that we have the specification, we're in a much better position to be able to plan out the development and to keep an eye over the costs to make sure that we don't blow the budget. So we're now speaking with a number of independent development companies and trusted people who I know are very high quality developers. So we're progressing that, and the next stage will be, or I anticipate that for the next meeting, we might be able to have some kind of very early preview to be able to demonstrate to everyone. I don't think we'll be ready for a launch for the next meeting, because February suddenly feels alarmingly close. So I think we'll be in mid-development in February, but I anticipate we'll at least have something to show to keep you updated on the actual progress that we're making.
And I'd also like to add to that we've some of you actually put your hand up and said they'd be like to be part of the development team and or project team as such, and we were going to take you up on that, and we'll be in touch to share with you the new specification on that, because we would like to see get your input to that too. So if you want to get involved, and we welcome as many as we can to get involved, so get your input, please let us know. And I won't say more hands make like work, but I think it's more heads will ensure that we actually are covering all the bases and deliver something which is what the members want at the end of the day, and that is a good information and intelligence sharing module.
I think the other task that we've got, Laurie, is to come up with a better name than information and intelligence sharing, which is a real mouthful.
Yes, I think maybe if anybody's got any good ideas to that, I'll put a nice bottle of wine up as a for the winner of that.
Competition time, excellent.
Yes, I think that's probably not a bad idea. So yeah, we started to call it Doris, but we decided that that didn't work either too much. So anyway, so as pretty much an update, but not a lot of meat on the bone. But just to let you know that we have been working in the background. We are moving it forward, and our proposal is, as you say, that we'll have something to tell you more about in February, and hopefully we'll also be able to give you a date on when we can kick it all off. So if anybody's got any thoughts on that, please put them in the chat box. So and volunteers, we'd love to hear from you. Okay, so we're going to move on. Really pleased to have Lee Robbins with us from Companies House. Lee, I'm sure will give you the background of the reform and the survey they did. It seems an age away now, Lee, but I'm sure it's
no, it was over a year ago.
Yeah, doesn't time fly? So are you okay as well for me to be your lovely assistant and put the slides on?
You do it so well, Laurie.
Thank you very much. Okay. Right, so over to you, Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. It's great to, well, not actually be with you, but to talk to you all this morning. It's already been some pretty interesting presentations, and I've been scribbling a few notes. One particular point I wanted to bring up related to Alan's presentation just before the break. He did mention that as part of the non-legislative easements that were introduced because of the COVID-19 stuff during the summer, Companies House for a period of time did have a suspension on the removal of companies from the register. He mentioned that had been restarted. I think voluntary dissolutions restarted in September, and compulsory dissolution started in October. So we did start off with a backlog, for want of a better description, of somewhere in the region of about 200,000 companies over the time frame where these easements were in place. But we've been gradually gazetting those companies, and actually this week was our target date to sort of catch up on all those. So the backlog that had been created because of this has now been caught up with. The other thing, just to say on the legislative easements before I get into my sort of presentation proper, is that we do still review the need to reintroduce legislative easements on a monthly basis, depending on the circumstances that are around us. I think when we're looking at it at the moment, the really big difference is that, as well as the non-legislative easements that we did introduce back in the summer, obviously the legislation itself has changed in terms of giving companies more time for certain filings, and that at the moment is seen as enough of a sort of an easement without us having to do things like suspending the strike off of companies. So yeah, just wanted to mention that before I started. If you'll go for the next slide, please. Okay, so Lee Robbins, Head of Enforcement. And when I accepted the invitation to talk today, that was my job. I've been in Companies House since 1988. so it's over 30 years. So I've done quite a few different roles within Companies House, and as of last week, I think it was, time's sort of flying at the moment, I moved into a new role as the service manager for enforcement. So whereas historically, as the head of enforcement, I would have been responsible for a big team of people and my service, we're going through a bit of a transformation in Companies House at the moment and moving into service ownership models. So we have 3 main services. One is about the output of information, one is about the incoming information, and then the third service is intelligence and enforcement. So my new job is to concentrate on those services while other colleagues sort of manage the profession in terms of managing the people. But you know, it's not wrong to say I don't think that I'm a head of enforcement, because that's what I was when I accepted the appointment. So if you could move on, and I'll just run through what I'm going to talk about this morning. It's mainly about the register reform consultation and the sort of the big talking points that are there. But I think it's useful to have a little bit of a brief sort of reflection in terms of some of the things that have got us to the point of, first of all, issuing that consultation in the summer of last year, where now more recently we've had the government's response, and it's allowed us to sort of gain a bit of traction in terms of moving forward. And then I'm going to round off with a couple of other things that are also hopefully relevant and interesting. But as with all the other speakers, if there are questions either during the presentation or in the chat or after, that's fine. I'm happy to take questions at any point. Next slide. Okay, so this is giving a little bit of background for my own sort of particular responsibility, if you like, within Companies House over the last 5 or 6 years, and the journey that we've been on to the point of now having significant proposals in terms of register reform. We've had compliance teams in Companies House for many years, where we've issued lots and lots of letters and taken phone calls and tried to sort of help customers with guidance to understand their sort of statutory responsibilities. But in 2014, there was a bit of a concerted effort to pull together a sort of an integrity type function, which, because of the issues in terms of our constraints of over the legislation, meant that there were some frustrating things that we were aware of and were unable to sort of prevent going on to the records. But it was something that we were still potentially able to do something about as a post-registration piece of work. So there were a number of integrity issues that we started to work with colleagues with more of a sort of data science background in terms of interrogating our own data and looking for issues to try to proactively resolve. As I said, it is a frustration, because in a way it would be great if we were in a position of being able to prevent those issues in the first place, and that's obviously the future direction. Back in 2014, 2015, this was still a little bit of a new approach for us, and there were quite a number of sort of successes in terms of fixing various pots of data. Some things we were able to do sort of proactively ourselves. Other things involved big campaigns and sort of mail shots and getting companies to correct data. Another area of really sort of significant growth during this time was our involvement with law enforcement and other government departments, mostly around fraud issues, but cutting across lots of sort of economic crime and beyond, really. Becoming members of the government agency intelligence network in around 2015 was a big sort of step for us, and we've gone on to have a really, really good, strong relationship with GAIN, And you know, I think that's been a mutually real rich vein of intelligence for them, and it's been great for us to sort of almost raise awareness with other members of GAIN of what the art of the possible is in terms of using companies' house information. The Small Business Enterprise and Employment Act came in during this time as well, and introduced a couple of new powers for Companies House, which were directly linked to fraud, really. So where a company had had its address, or an individual had had their address used as you know, fraudulently, and had been put onto the public record as the registered office of a company, or someone indeed had been appointed to a company without their knowledge. Prior to 2015, we had those sorts of inquiries, and unfortunately, all we could say was, "Sorry, you're going to have to get a court order," and there's nothing more Companies House can do. The powers that that were introduced at the time, if I'm honest, they are a bit clunky. They could be better, and hopefully we will look to improve them as part of the future register reform work. But it is a step forward, and it does mean that in some circumstances now, once we've followed the process, there is potential to default the registered office of a company to the company's house address, or to remove fraudulently appointed directors. So it's not all about a lengthy and sometimes costly court process. You know, just to give you an idea, I think over the last 6 months, there's been somewhere in the region of about 1,200 registered offices, I think, that have been defaulted to the company's house address. And I think about 500 directors that have been removed using these powers as well. So that is, again, useful. Enforcement action, you know, we've got high levels of compliance for accounts, confirmation statements, and PSE information. And we did a really, really good piece of work about 18 months ago with HMRC, where the Cabinet Office used the new legislation under the Digital Economy Act to do a data pilot where Companies House and HMRC compared 4 years worth of accounts information for the same companies to look to see where there were discrepancies, looking to see whether there was any evidence of fraud or error. So that was a really interesting piece of work, and again a bit of a forerunner to the sort of thing that we would like to do with new powers in the future. That in itself, as I said, I think that there was somewhere in the region of about £14 million worth of tax that HMRC were able to chase on the back of the work that we did there. And that piece of work also sort of, some work streams from it became business as usual as well. So we graduated from being a pilot into having a new gateway for sharing information in that way. And then just to mention briefly, earlier this year, under the 5th Money Laundering Directive, the UK transposed the changes into the money laundering regulations. And since January, we've been receiving discrepancy reports from obliged entities, such as banks, accountants, solicitors, and so on, who were regulated under the money laundering regs. And that's been quite useful as well. So if we go for the next slide. You may be familiar with some of these things, but I think it always helps just to give create the sort of the backdrop for this. We have a really transparent register. I think in our last financial year, information a Companies House was accessed, I think, is 9.4 billion times. So there's a lot of data, and it's very transparent, and there's a lot of interest in it. We've got a lot of companies, we've got a lot of directors. I think there's also somewhere in the region of about 5.5 million PSEs that we have on the register, and we continue to incorporate high levels of companies as well as removing them. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly just mention a couple of sort of almost external factors that I think, again, have helped to set the scene in terms of getting us to the point of where we are with register reform. Back in the back end of 2017 and into 2018, the UK went through the FATF assessment, the Financial Action Task Force. And overall, the report was quite positive towards the UK. There are about 11 elements to the assessment. I was involved in the assessment around beneficial ownership, and it wasn't something the Companies House would normally have played any role in a FATF assessment, because we'd introduced the PSE register in 2016. It meant that we were one of the organisations that ended up giving a lot of evidence to the assessors. So it was, as I said, overall very positive, but they still were concerned about the level of verification. In fact, that there isn't any verification. And I think they were also concerned that others in the sort of the money laundering, AML type sectors had information that could potentially be useful as well. And I think that's where the recommendation came for introducing discrepancy reporting in the 5MLD. But you know, this did really push. I think it was an extra push towards, well, Companies House and BEIS need to do something about the verification of information at Companies House. Next slide. Also, economic crime plan. You know, there are a couple of key things in there in terms of the reform of Companies House. So BEIS, I think, only have one or two actions within the UK economic crime plan. One is about register reform, and I think the other is about the register of overseas entities and beneficial owners. So again, you know, there's another driver towards giving Companies House more powers, which is also useful. So next slide. So on to register reform itself. I think, as Laurie mentioned, it was in the summer of 2019 that we consulted on register reform. It was a really big consultation, and we received well over 1,300 responses, which for something like this is a really sort of significant number of responses. Overall, there was a lot of support for the various measures that were suggested, and it's been a little bit frustrating for me personally that it's taken as long as it has for us to get the government response out. You know, there's been a lot of things happening, so I could sort of list lots of excuses as to why it's taken as long as it has, but thankfully I think it was in late September this year, the government response came out and confirmed the direction of travel and all that information. So that's all online on gov.uk if anyone's interested in going into that a bit more. Next slide. So this isn't going to be news to you, but these were some of the reasons why we consulted in the first place. We're concerned about the misuse of UK registered entities. We're concerned about the accuracy of the information, a bit like FATF and others. There's also concern about the abuse of personal information. So in terms of identity theft, identity fraud, although there were already some measures in place, such as directors having service addresses and partially suppressed dates of birth, there is still concern about some of the personal information that is on the register. And also, it's this perhaps inability, because of the way legislation is framed, both the Companies Act and the legislation across other potential partners, whether that's law enforcement, other government departments, or even some of the sort of the professional body supervisors. You know, there needs to be, I think it's already something that's been touched on this morning, a better way of sharing information is going to be, the right direction to travel in. Next slide. So this is our vision. Just backs up those points really. What we want it to be reliable and accurate. We want to have a better balance in terms of the protection of personal data. We do already have high compliance rates, but we want to continue with that. And we want to have perhaps a more robust and holistic approach to enforcement. We want to be able to share information two ways. And as part of that also, we want to make the most of our sort of internal transformation in terms of making sure that we've got the skills and experience to be able to deliver all these things. And ultimately, as I said, it's reducing the level of sort of economic crime and the misuse of corporate vehicles. So if we move on to the next slide and into the actual response that came out a few months ago. It's an 80-something page document, so there's a lot of detail in there, but these are perhaps four of the big areas. First of all, identity verification, probably the number one on everyone's Christmas list. And the proposal is that Companies House will undertake identity verification for directors, for PSEs, and also for all presenters of information at Companies House. So there will be a way of directly verifying with us. There'll also be a route where, so for example, if a company is incorporated directly with Companies House, they'll go through the Companies House identity verification process. But if they go through an agent, that will be okay, but the agent will have to provide the same level of evidence of identity verification that would apply in direct incorporations. One of the sort of significant impacts, I suppose, with identity verification in terms of directors is that it changes the legal timing of when somebody becomes a director. So at the moment, if someone is appointed as a director and they go through whatever the internal processes are for a company, the notification that comes to Companies House, other than on an incorporation basis, is really just telling us about something that's already taken place. So they have 14 days to tell us if they do it in a timely manner. Sometimes, not everybody does it within the 14 days, but it doesn't alter the fact that that person has been correctly appointed as a director as per the articles of the company and so on. With identity verification, the legal effect timing will be, the proposal is that it's linked to the verification process. So until an individual has passed the verification process, they won't legally be a director. And I think, there are some lawyers and policy colleagues who are sort of scratching their heads about how exactly that will work. But as I said, it's going to be for PSEs as well, which is going to be a harder thing to do. And the legal effect thing obviously doesn't apply in the context of people with significant control. Yeah, so that's the direction of travel for identity verification. One of the real interesting areas from my perspective in terms of working in the enforcement area within Companies House is the proposals around reforming Companies House powers and giving the registrar stronger powers to query information at different stages. So I mentioned earlier that as part of our recent journey, we've done some post-registration integrity work where we've spotted a problem and then we've got in touch with the company. I think we'll still be able to do some of that in the new world, but we will have stronger powers for querying things and potentially changing things. But the big step forward is that if, for example, we get a document submitted to Companies House, we will potentially have the ability to sort of put the brakes on and say, right, well, before we proceed with either accepting or rejecting this document, we are concerned for some reason or another, and we will make those inquiries before deciding how to proceed. That's not to say that we're going to slow down the process and that everything will take days and days longer than it does now, but it's on a risk-based approach. If we have some concerns, and again, you know, I've used the word frustration a few times already this morning. This is another area where sometimes we will get a document that we are concerned about, but legally we have no option but to put the document onto the register. This is the sort of power that would, in those circumstances, mean that we would have more options of really identifying how best to play it. So yeah, that's going to be a really interesting one, and it's something that we're going to consult on a little bit more very soon. I'll mention on the next slide. Protecting information, I've mentioned a few times. There have already been powers introduced over the last couple of years that allow some information to be suppressed or for people to apply for protection. This is really just to extend some of those ideas where it is appropriate. You know, we have the ability to suppress a registered office address if it's met the criteria for someone wanting to suppress that. No, actually, that's the wrong way around. That's the example I was going to give. We've got the ability to suppress the director's addresses and things, but not the registered office address. So there are some sort of scenarios where it'll allow us to apply greater sort of consistency, so that rather than saying in some circumstances we can be supportive and suppress or protect information, but there are other things that we can't. Sometimes it doesn't really make sense. So what we're looking for is to have a sort of more common sense approach in the way that we do that. And then finally on this slide, the accounts, you know, a big area, and again, another area that we're going to consult on further. The sorts of things that are being considered here, I know they've been mentioned in the past, but the potential possibly to file once with government. So whether we link up with the likes of HMRC and the Charity Commission, and you know, that's a possibility. Also, the full mandation of accounts being filed electronically, possibly with some additional fields that we don't have at the moment. For those who are techie among you, as part of the mandation, there's talk of mandating the tagging of the information so that it's easier to interrogate from an IXBRL perspective. And I think one of the other things that's being considered is whether there needs to be sort of stronger measures in place when companies are taking advantage of filing a reduced set of information. So years ago, when I first started in Companies House, the majority of accounts filed here were all audited. Over the last 30 years, lots more accounts fall under the audit exemption levels, form some sort of an abbreviated type of accounts. That's not to say that abbreviated accounts of some description won't be able to be filed in the future, but there may be a little bit more give and take in terms of people having to evidence that they meet the criteria rather than it just being accepted in good faith. Next slide. Okay, so I did mention this. We had that consultation back in the summer. We've just had the government response, and what we've said in that government response is that we've highlighted what the response generally was from stakeholders and so on. But there were three areas where we said we're going to consult further on. It's going to be a slightly different type of approach, and it's involving these three areas. So the reform of powers that I talked about, accounts that I just mentioned as well. So when they were mentioned in the original consultation, it was very blue skies thinking. There wasn't a great deal of detail about what we were proposing. So the idea with the further consultations on these is to give a lot more structured to what is being considered at the moment. We're aiming to get those consultations out imminently. It's sometimes difficult to sort of find a slot in the sort of machinery of government, but I'm aware that they have been pulled together, and it's something that we're working hard to potentially get out even this side of Christmas. But if for some reason that doesn't happen, I'm sure they'll go out early in the new year at the latest. And the one I haven't mentioned is corporate directors. So there was some work done probably 5 or 6 years ago on the potential ban of corporate directors generally, but with some exemptions and exceptions. That has been sort of bobbing along in the background for some time, and has made its way to the surface again. So there will be some further information around the proposals for corporate directors. I think potentially that's one of the ones that we may see some action on sooner than others, because it is one that has, as a concept, has been with us for the longest period of time. Next slide. Okay, and if you can click again, that's great, yeah. So this is, in terms of the sort of the enforcement and intelligence side of things, this is sort of just an illustration of a vision, if you like, so that we've got the company data coming into Companies House, whether that's electronically, ever increasingly, that I imagine there'll still be some paper for some time, but it goes through layers of checks. So we've got the compliance and validation checks, probably not unlike the checks that already take place now, but then we're going to have this extra level of sort of identity verification. And also running in the background, we're keen to develop our capabilities of having something like a risk engine, which will also sort of feed into our sort of ability to make proactive decisions. And once the data that comes in has gone through all of those things, it'll eventually make itself onto the register. And then you've got all the usual outputs to the sorts of users there on the right hand side of the screen. And then you're back to the model that, again, we sort of have today, in that there is always going to be the ability to get feedback from all those users in terms of any issues that there is with the data. So yeah, I think that it's not, you know, there's some elements of this that apply today, but I think when you add in the identity verification and the risk analysis, then that's sort of signifies where the difference is going forward. Okay, if we go for the next slide. Okay then, so coming towards the end of the main part of my presentation, I just wanted to touch upon a couple of other things that I have very briefly mentioned, just to confirm where they are in terms of all the things that are going on in Companies House at the moment, and then if anybody wants me to go into any more detail about any of the things I've already mentioned in terms of register reform or anything else, I'd be happy to do that. So first of all, I did briefly mention 5MLD and the PSE discrepancy reporting. We've had, I think it's over 6,000 reports now from obliged entities since this started in January. When it started in January, it was pretty slow, understandably, because there was very little information around when it was implemented. The government response on 5MLD didn't come out until after implementation, so it meant that the guidance and communications that would normally have occurred didn't happen in the way that you would normally want them to happen. But having said that, it has gradually built up, and we're seeing somewhere in the region of about 1,000 reports per month. For any of you or anyone you know who comes into that category of being an obliged entity. The requirement is for you to, as part of your onboarding of new clients, to when you do your due diligence checks, that if you identify any discrepancies between the beneficial ownership information that the potential client is providing to you and other sources, compared to the public register, there is now a legal requirement to report that to Companies House. And we've got a responsibility then to investigate that and to try and get it corrected. We, for tactical reasons, needed to introduce a interim technical solution. So for anyone who has had reason to use it, you know, I can put my hand up and say it is a clunky process. It's not like most of the services that you would used to be using from Companies House. We have been working on another service that is more integrated and more like services that you would expect from Companies House. We'll be looking to move into a private beta stage for that new service in the next month or so, potentially then going into a public beta stage towards the end of Q4, I would guess. So that's the 5MLD. And then all I wanted to say was that limited partnership reform and the Register of Overseas Beneficial Ownership were separate pieces of reform legislation that have been on the books for the last couple of years. As part of the recent announcements around register reform, the intention is to pull all this work together, potentially into some sort of super bill. So rather than limited partnership reform being dealt with in isolation, then you'll see all these things potentially being looked at together. I think I did notice a question pop up before when I started on this slide in terms of the timing for register reform. As you can imagine, there's an awful lot of work to get through. We don't know what the government's timetable for new legislation is going to be, but I think we and BEIS are working on the basis of targeting to get a draft bill into Parliament before the end of next year. And then we'll look at legislative time slots depending on what comes from the government. So yeah, that's what I wanted to mention in terms of those, unless anybody wants to know anything more about Robo or limited partnerships in particular. And the next slide is the last slide. So I don't know if I go back to Laurie now, or if anybody wants to come off mute and ask anything.
Yeah, Lee, I'll kick off if I may. As I'm sure you know, that Companies House always had that. There was always that view that Companies House was a filing cabinet. With the reform of your powers, are you happy that that's going to change that view? Do you think for the future? Absolutely.
You know, I think we view this as potentially the biggest change in the history of company registration. I think it's been quoted in some press articles that it would be, you know, the biggest change since 1844 when the joint stock companies were first set up. So you're right. We have been a paper factory or simply a registry that accepted everything in good faith. But if I'm honest, you know, that doesn't do us justice in terms of some of the work that we have done in the last 4 or 5 years, in terms of, for want of a better description, growing the brand of Companies House and reaching out to stakeholders, particularly law enforcement, to make them aware of how much useful information we have. But we've only ever been able to do things on a reactive basis. And what I see as the biggest change for Companies House is that its purpose could potentially change from being simply a registry to being one where we are actively looking to identify suspicious activity on our register and to package that up as an intelligence package and refer to the appropriate partner. So yeah, I think, you know, it's a good question, and I believe strongly that we're not going to be just regarded as that registry that we historically have been.
That's really good. I've got some other questions, but I might as well carry on.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is there going to be any changes to pricing? Because I always felt that you were too cheap, if you like, and you could actually make a lot of money and, of course, plough the money back, and that helps develop your services.
Yeah, it's an interesting position, and I think, as I said, I've been in Companies House a long time, and I know that all governments of all persuasions over the last 20 years or so, it's all been about deregulation and making things simpler, quicker, and cheaper, and that's been the focus that we've put on ourselves. And the other thing is that although our parent department is BEIS, which is obviously part of central government, from a funding point of view, we've been something called a trade-in fund, and it's meant that we have been self-sufficient, so we don't go to the Treasury as part of the spending review and say we need X amount of money to run the business next year. We set our fees, and it's supposed to be done on a cost recovery basis. So although those fees have been coming down over the years, it's been based on improved efficiencies in terms of how we've done things. From April this year, that's changed, and we're no longer a trading fund. We've Companies House has been absorbed back into central government from a funding position. So we are now part of those funding reviews. So if spending reviews, sorry. So if if the government have economic crime as a really high on their agenda, and they see Companies House as playing a significant part in it, then I suppose the challenge is for them to be able to fund the types of activities that are going to be needed. So things like identity verification will definitely have to be paid for as part of some of the work I've seen. I don't think it's going to massively increase the price of incorporations, for example. But you're right, I've heard lots of people suggest that the current fees are so low that there's a lot of wriggle room to, if you doubled or trebled the fee, most people wouldn't really be that unhappy about it. As I said, I don't think there is necessarily going to need to be as high an increase as that, but what we will have to do is, even if we are part of central government, we will still have to do it on a cost recovery basis. So if it costs us, 25-30 pounds to incorporate a company in the future, then that's how the fees will be set. But there's having so much delivered online has made a big difference, I think, in terms of the costs.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Lee. Anybody else out there want to ask a question?
Lee, can I, before my question, I'd just like to say that thank you for the presentation, and speaking from Graydon in particular, and BIPA, which is the Association of Credit Reference Agencies, we all very much welcome and are enthusiastic about the news from Companies House and the reforms that are planned. So it seems very positive from our perspective. I'm particularly interested in the new right to query documents that are being filed, and you talked through the risk engine that new information will have to go through, and I'm assuming that's all AI. You haven't got someone reading every document as it comes in. But does that right to query, is that just at the point of the information being filed, or can you go back to information that's already on the register if issues are raised or you discover something yourselves?
Yeah, I think we want to have the flexibility to use that power in a number of different ways, and it's something I think that we will be in the consultation that I mentioned in terms of the powers, where our current thinking will be shared on that. But I think you're right, it's very much almost a blended sort of approach. So I think in the last couple of years, I mentioned, I think probably even 2 or 3 years ago, well, probably 4 or 5 years ago, I'd never heard of a data scientist. Now, the fact that we've got, head of data science, and and we've got projects and things that are working in that way, even in an integrity space, being able to interrogate our data and to run these clever sort of algorithms to identify issues has been a really big help from my point of view in terms of running an operational team and making some sort of data led decisions, if you like, on how to prioritize things. So I think going forward with the powers, we will probably start off with something reasonably straightforward in terms of known typologies that we will or that we've had shared with us by partners, and we'll sort of plug that in terms of trying to pick up that information, but we want to almost work to the point in the end where you have machine learning and the systems are almost going to be potentially clever enough to identify suspicious behavior that we're not aware of, or that our partners are not even aware of. So at the moment, we're still very dependent on NCA, City of London Police, the Met, HMRC, the Insolvency Service coming to us and saying, right, we're concerned about this. Or they put a DPA request in saying, we've got an ongoing investigation and we need some information about this person. Once we've got that information, because we have a really large footprint of back office information as well as all the public information, there's an awful lot of network analysis and stuff that can be done. And as I said, a lot of that is already happening, but only on a reactive basis. And I think where the querying power might come in is if I give an example of, and this is just, this may not actually pan out eventually, but if I had a request from the NCA today saying that we're really concerned about Nigel Dickinson. What have you got on him? And we went away and looked at all our records and said, no, we haven't got anything on Nigel Dickinson. Now, whether we in the future would be able to sort of save that as a piece of intelligence and to add it to our risk engine in some way, and then when Nigel Dickinson came back to us in a month's time to set up a company, whether that then would ring alarm bells and would allow us to use our powers to either query or to reach out to whatever law enforcement partner had sort of had given us that intelligence in the first place about the best way of doing things. That's the sort of thing. But I think there are lots and lots of different ways that could. But I think the main thing I would say is that I don't think we want to be too prescriptive. Yeah, sorry, I've gone on a little bit there.
That's great, thank you.
Lee, thanks very much indeed. That was really, really interesting, and we'll ask you back in a year. You can tell us where you got to. So. Okay.
Thanks, Laurie. Thanks,
Okay.
Nigel.
No, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, we're now going to do the workshop. I'm actually going to hand it. Darren, are you there? Darren, are you there?
It would help if I unmuted myself, wouldn't it?
I'm going to hand over the controls to you, if that's all right.
Oh, I thought you were going to keep control. I thought you were supposed to be in control today.
I need you to take control. Then I can pop to the little boys' room because.
I see. Okay.
Sitting here with my legs crossed. It's
okay.
So you've now got control. Can you just check that you've got control?
Let's have a look. I need to request the remote control first. You should have a request for me to, yeah, I've got control now.
Okay, right, I shall be back in a
minute. Okay, so we, in our effort to ensure that we do not run these forums as death by PowerPoint, we decided to set up a little workshop. I use the term workshop in its loosest sense. I think it's probably going to be more of a discussion around what we are seeing at the moment, what kind of impacts we have experienced because of the pandemic and the way that we are working differently, with many of us working remotely at the moment. As by means of introduction, I wanted to point out a few resources that are quite useful for keeping an eye as to what the current trends are when it comes to coronavirus-related fraud or pandemic-related fraud. One of which is the Fraud Advisory Panel. It's not been updated for a few weeks now, but they had been doing updates every other week, pointing out the current COVID-19 fraud risks and giving out some good advice and good tips for prevention. So I do recommend having a look there. Unsurprisingly, and this was certainly mentioned by some of our speakers earlier, we're seeing a lot of increase in phishing emails, campaigns to try and trick you into thinking that it's HMRC or some other agency offering out the various different benefits and different recovery schemes. But we're also seeing things like fake fines for individuals that have allegedly broken lockdown rules, and again, a lot of business impersonation because we're all a bit distracted and working much more remotely than we ever have done before in many cases. As ever, there is a lot of misinformation on the internet, and this has been picking up again very recently because of the new vaccines that are coming on board now, and there is a lot of misinformation around the safety or non-safety of the vaccines, a lot of anti-vaxxers out there, and this also kind of creates an environment where fraud can be committed quite easily, or where people become more susceptible and more easily targeted. Finally, Take 5 to Stop Fraud, which I know CIFAS are also involved with. They have also been pushing out a lot of information and some good campaigns. They've also been talking a lot and doing campaigns around the money muling issue that we have been discussing earlier as well. Another good source of general information and general updates, and they do some pretty good campaigns. There's a very short video which I'm going to show now, which they've published to highlight how to spot a phishing email. And I know for some of you this is going to be teaching you to suck eggs, but it is quite useful, and it might be something you might want to hand around to your colleagues and to your staff. So let's see if this works. No sound on this one, so it's just a little animated video. So what they're pointing out there are some of the very common issues: not genuine email addresses, non-personalized emails, offer of a reward, and dodgy-looking URLs that do not match up with the genuine domain names for a particular organization. And so the Take 5 campaign has all been about trying to educate the public to take a step back and think, and not just instantly react when you get a message out of the blue, a telephone call out of the blue, and hopefully by doing that, it will prevent some of the frauds. So yeah, I do recommend having a look at that. And as I mentioned, there is a specific Money Mules campaign, which is tied in with this campaign. It's got the same look and feel. And as I mentioned, CIFAS and UK Finance are partners within that as well. So that's also a good website to go to. You'll get these links as well post this session today. And as I said, I don't wish this to be death by PowerPoint, so that is all the slides that we're going to show.
Okay, we're going to finish a little bit earlier, so just to say thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed this morning. I must say a big thank you to all of our presenters. I think some really excellent presentations. We will doctor the recording and make the recording available to you and also to anybody that missed today. So I think there's one more slide just to say a big thank you to everybody. Please keep safe and well. And the pandemic is still out there. It's not going away. The next meeting's on the 18th of February. It will be virtual. And there's a big white space there. There's only one thing else I can put into that big white space, really, is there? So wish you Merry Christmas. So a couple of
very sparkly this year, Laurie.
That's it, very sparkly. I thought so too. And a couple of chats here. So can you send slides? Yes, Jane. Yes, we will. And Darren's put his information on there as well. So, all right, thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Yeah, keep safe and Merry Christmas.